Hello everyone. I am the storyteller, and I'm here to help you unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep. I know many of you use this video to help you relax, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Feel free to share in the comments below. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's start this journey together. Take a deep breath, and relax. Story: The Vanishing Trail. It was a quiet afternoon when I drove my RV into TTHIS National Forest. The smell of damp earth hung in the air as mist curled lazily around the towering trees. The atmosphere felt thick, almost as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been doing my usual routine, filming hikes, nature walks, and camping trips, but my vlog had started to stagnate. Views were dropping, and I was stuck in a rut. Then, a hiker I met on the last trail told me about something that sounded like it could bring the excitement back to my channel, a legend about an unmarked trail in TTHIS National Forest, a trail that was said to vanish and reappear, its path elusive and unpredictable. Locals swore it would lead you in circles, and those who ventured too far never came back. Perfect. I'd always been a skeptic, never one to fall for ghost stories or supernatural tales. But this sounded like something worth chasing. If I could find that trail, document it, and show my audience the strange occurrences surrounding it, I'd have a viral story on my hands. So, I packed my camera, grabbed my gear, and set off to find this vanishing trail. My RV rolled to a stop in a secluded clearing, the mist still thick, blanketing the forest floor. I grabbed my camera, rolling it as I stepped out into the damp air. "Hey, everyone, it's Nate." I spoke into the lens, smiling with my usual enthusiasm. "I'm here in the misty TTHIS National Forest, and today, I'm on the hunt for the infamous vanishing trail. Legend has it, this trail disappears without a trace, and anyone who follows it too far, well, they never come back. Let's see if that's true." The air around me felt different, heavy, almost as though the forest itself were listening, waiting for me to step deeper into its grasp. I shoved my skepticism aside and set off down a narrow path that wound between gnarled trees, their trunks disappearing into the fog. My boots crunched on the damp leaves as I walked, the only sound in the stillness. I wasn't worried. After all, I had GPS, a camera, and a ton of experience hiking solo. The legend seemed like a fun story to tell, nothing more. As I walked deeper into the forest, the fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing against me, clinging to my skin like a cold, wet blanket. But then, I saw it. A stone slab, half buried in the dirt, its surface covered with strange symbols. They weren't anything I recognized, curved spirals, jagged lines, almost as if they were from another time, another world. I filmed it, describing the find. "This looks like something from an ancient burial site, but there's nothing on the maps about this. Makes you wonder, what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog?" But that was only the beginning. As I moved forward, the trail became fainter, more overgrown, until it was barely a path at all. Soon, I found myself following what could only be described as a game trail, a barely there path that seemed to be more suggestion than reality. The trees closed in around me, and I kept filming, though my nerves started to prickle. After what felt like hours, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path, and the next, it was gone. The mist had swallowed it up, leaving me standing in an open patch of forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed no Path, no landmarks, just a blinking dot that represented me, lost in the middle of nowhere. I muttered under my breath, okay, this is weird. The trees looked different now. The fog had swallowed the landscape, and the air felt colder. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but everything seemed distorted. The trees were too close, the undergrowth too dense. The trail was gone, and the fog was so thick, I could barely see a few feet ahead. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, somewhere off to my left. I spun around, scanning the mist, but I saw nothing. The footsteps kept coming, closer now. I tightened my grip on my camera and stepped forward, ready to document whoever, I was about to find. A figure emerged from the fog. An older man, his clothes tattered, wet and covered in mud. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant. There was something unsettling about him. "Hey!" I called out. "You lost too?" He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his face distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I've been walking for days. The trail, it keeps changing." I frowned. "Are you okay? Where's the trail?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "No one's okay out here. The trail isn't just a path, it moves. The forest moves. It doesn't want us to leave." I felt a chill creep down my spine. My rational mind screamed that he was just delirious, but something in his tone, something in his eyes, made me uneasy. "I have a GPS," I said, pulling it from my pocket. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the screen of my GPS. His eyes widened. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. Not really. I'd been hiking in the woods for years, nothing had ever felt wrong. But, as I looked around, the fog pressing in, the trees feeling like they were closing in on us, I started to wonder. We started walking together, my GPS useless, the man, Eli, he'd introduced himself as, growing more agitated with each passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered, his eyes darting around nervously. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "The forest. It's alive, Nate. And it's been here long before we were." I was about to respond when I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like the wind through the trees. But then, it became clearer. "Nate." I froze. My heart began to hammer in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his face a mask of fear. "It's calling us. The forest is calling us." I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Rationally, I knew it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. We pushed forward, but the forest didn't seem to be the same anymore. The trees grew closer. Together. The air thickened. The whispers grew louder. And then we found it, an old backpack, tangled in the branches of a tree. It looked abandoned, dirty, torn, and covered in moss. But when I climbed up to get it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, granola bars, even a map. Someone had packed this recently. Someone who had been here long after the backpack had been abandoned. Eli's eyes were wide with terror. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Before it's too late." But as we turned to leave, things got worse. We walked in circles. No matter which way we went, we kept ending up back at the same spot. The fog had turned into something almost tangible, pressing in on us, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. The whispers, voices, now, were unmistakable. Nate. I whipped around, calling out for Eli, but he was gone. Just like that. One moment, he was next to me, and the next, he was swallowed by the mist. I called his name, panic creeping into my voice. But there was no answer. Only the dense fog and the whispers that seemed to be closing in on me, louder now, all calling my name. I was alone. I stumbled forward, panic setting in as I realized the forest was trapping me. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end, and no matter where I turned, I found myself back where I started. The trees had changed. The fog twisted in unnatural shapes. I didn't know what was real anymore. I ran, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my camera capturing distorted, shaky footage. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, figures that disappeared the moment I focused on them. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was losing grip on reality. But then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the fog lifted. The trees cleared, and I found myself standing on the edge of the forest, staring at my RV. I didn't wait. I sprinted back to my vehicle, slammed the door behind me, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my hands shaking on the wheel. Back at home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I had lived through, the vanishing trail, the whispers, Eli's disappearance. But when I played it back, all I saw was nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick. Eli. He wasn't in the footage at all. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had all been a bad trip, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest hadn't forgotten me. It had let me leave, but only for now. And somewhere, out there, in the midst of the trees, I had a feeling it was still waiting for me. Weeks passed since I left TTHIS National Forest. My heart had barely stopped pounding since the night I fled. I told myself it was just a bad experience, maybe I had gotten too wrapped up in the eerie atmosphere, or maybe I had just been too tired, too deep in my own head to make sense of it. But every night, when I closed my eyes, I saw the fog. I heard the whispers calling my name. And worst of all, I saw Eli and #39's vacant face, the way he had disappeared. Without a trace. I couldn't let it go. Something told me I hadn't uncovered the whole story. The forest had been too strange, too alive, for me to brush it off. And the footage, that distorted, flickering footage, it didn't add up. I wasn't crazy. Eli had been there, I had talked to him. The backpack with fresh supplies, where had it come from? The whole experience had felt like I was trapped in some otherworldly puzzle. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just walk away. I needed answers. I packed up my gear again, grabbed my camera, and drove back to TTHIS National Forest. The RV felt heavier this time, almost like it was a vessel heading back into the heart of something dark. My stomach churned as I pulled up to the same secluded clearing I had parked in before. The mist hung thick in the air, even though it was mid-morning. It wasn't natural. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted upward as though beckoning me. The moment I stepped out, the weight of the forest pressed against me, its silence almost suffocating. I checked my GPS again. It was working perfectly, showing me a clear path through the trees, but I knew from experience now that it wouldn't stay accurate for long. I had no clear plan this time. I was going to track down the vanishing trail again and see if I could find out what had happened to Eli, or if he was still out there somewhere. I followed the trail, the ground squelching beneath my boots as I walked deeper into the fog. The air grew colder, and the weight of the mist made it harder to breathe. Everything felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite describe. But I pushed forward, determined to get answers. After a while, the trail started to thin out again, just as it had the first time. The trees grew closer together, their branches like twisted fingers reaching out to block the way. This time, though, I didn't feel lost yet. I kept my eyes sharp, watching every step I took, every shift in the fog. Then, I found it. A stone slab, just like before. Only this time, the symbols on it were more defined, clearer, almost like they were calling out to me. My fingers brushed the surface, and I felt an odd shiver run through me. It was almost like the stone was alive, pulsing beneath my touch. I filmed it again, describing the strange symbols for my audience, but something in the air felt different. There was a hum, a vibration just beneath the surface of everything, as though the forest itself was awake, aware of my presence. I decided to keep going. The trail continued to fade in and out, just like before. I moved forward, my heart starting to race as I realized the fog had begun to thicken once more, swallowing the path entirely. The world around me blurred. My GPS flickered, its signal weak. I had no choice but to rely on instinct. And then, it happened again. The trail was gone. Completely. As if it had never been there. The trees and underbrush closed in around me, creating an impenetrable wall. My mind screamed, but I kept filming, the camera capturing the dense fog and the eerily silent forest. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Crunching on the leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the mist. My heart skipped a beat. It was Eli. He looked the same, but different. His clothes were tattered and soaked, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, though, they were wide, empty, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Eli. I called out, my voice shaky. He didn't respond at first, just stared at me with that vacant expression. And then, his voice came, but it was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. End quote. You shoot and hashtag 39, T have come back, end quote. I felt my stomach drop. End quote. Eli, where have you been? What happened, end quote. His eyes darted around nervously. The forest, it's alive. It traps you. It makes you forget. Forget? I repeated, stepping closer. Eli, what are you talking about? We need to get out of here. The trail, he muttered, his voice shaking. It moves. It doesn't want anyone to leave. Once you're in, it won't let you go. I took a step back, confusion clouding my thoughts. End quote. What are you saying? Eli, we need to get back to the RV. Please, we have to get out of here, end quote. But Eli just shook his head slowly, his eyes darting to the mist behind me. It's waiting for you, he whispered. It knows you're here. I glanced behind me, but saw nothing. Just the same swirling fog. Suddenly, something deep inside me screamed, get out. But before I could react, Eli turned and bolted into the mist. Eli! I yelled, but he was already gone, swallowed by the fog as if he had never been there at all. I stood frozen for a moment, the fog thickening again around me. Panic set in, and I tried to retrace my steps, hoping to find the clearing, the RV, something that would break the madness that was slowly closing in around me. But every direction I turned, I found myself right back where I started. The whispers began again. Nate. Nate. I turned sharply, my camera now shaking violently in my hand. Figures, dark shapes, moved in the periphery of my vision. Shadows flickering in and out of focus, as if they were playing tricks on my eyes. My heart raced. The trees seemed to twist, growing larger, taller. The forest felt like it was alive, breathing around me. I started running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the fog, the whispers, the dark shapes watching me from the shadows. At some point, I collapsed to the ground, my hands shaking. I knew I couldn't survive out here forever. I needed to find a way out, or I'd end up like Eli, lost forever in the mist. I raised the camera, filming my face, my desperation. If anyone sees this, don't come to TTHIS National Forest. Don't follow the vanishing trail. It's not what you think. It's not just a trail. It's a prison. A trap. I choked back tears as I realized the truth. This forest, this place, it wasn't just some random area of wilderness. It had been here long before we had, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. The fog closed in around me, thicker now, more suffocating. My camera flickered and died in my hands. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the forest, back to the RV. The fog had lifted, and I found myself standing on the edge of the clearing, the mist still swirling at the forest's edge. I didn't waste any time. I threw my camera, my gear into the RV, slammed the door, and sped off. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant, haunted memory in my rearview mirror. When I got home, I reviewed the footage one last time. The screen was fuzzy, distorted, everything looked wrong. The camera had caught brief glimpses of something moving through the fog, shadowy figures, but nothing concrete. Eli's face, though, wasn't there anymore. I watched, rewatched, hoping I had missed something, some clue that could explain everything. But there was nothing. It was as if the forest had erased him. It had erased everything. I tried to convince myself that I had just been stressed, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The forest had let me leave. But it had also marked me. I glanced at the screen one last time. In the corner of the frame, a shadowy figure moved, just outside the reach of the lens. It paused for a moment, as if watching me. And then it disappeared. I wasn't alone. The days following my return home felt like a blur. I tried to push the experience out of my mind, telling myself it was just a bad trip, a combination of fatigue and fear. But the whispers never stopped. They followed me in my dreams, in the empty spaces between my waking hours. At night, I could hear them, faintly, calling my name. The phone rang one evening, an unknown number. I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something told me not to answer, but I picked up anyway. Nate, a voice crackled on the other end. It was hoarse, weak, but unmistakable. You're not safe. My blood turned cold. I recognized the voice immediately, it was Eli. Eli. I stammered. Where are you? What's happening? Are you? The line cut out before I could finish. I tried calling back, but the number didn't connect. Panic surged in my chest as I realized the message had been a warning. My connection to the forest wasn't over. It was only just beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air felt like it was part of something larger, something closing in on me. The forest's grip had never fully loosened. At 3 a.m., I woke with a start. I couldn't breathe. It was like the air itself had thickened. The fog. I could smell it. I rushed to my window and looked out. A dense mist had settled over my neighborhood, eerily similar to the one in TTHIS. It wasn't natural. There was something wrong with the way it rolled through the streets, creeping closer and closer to my house. The phone rang again, this time an unknown caller with no number. I ignored it. I couldn't stay there. The longer I lingered in my home, the more I could feel the forest's pull. The whispers grew louder. My skin crawled every time I looked at the mirror, my own reflection seemed off. The pale face of Eli, those vacant eyes, haunted me. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I packed my things quickly, not thinking about the consequences. I couldn't risk being hunted by whatever force controlled that forest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to undo whatever it was that had happened to me. I wasn't sure if I was running toward safety or straight into the heart of danger, but I couldn't ignore the call any longer. By the time I reached TTHIS, the fog had grown even thicker. The air was colder, the trees more gnarled, more alive. My RV creaked and groaned as I parked at the same clearing. A dread, deep and ancient, settled over me as soon as I stepped out. I had to face whatever it was that had followed me, whatever had claimed Eli, whatever the forest wanted from me. With camera in hand, I entered the mist once more. The trees closed in around me like old friends, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. It didn't take long before I found the markers again, strange symbols carved into stone slabs, older than anything I could fathom. This time, they felt different, more powerful. The symbols spoke to me in a language I couldn't understand, but deep inside, I knew they weren't meant for me. They were warnings. I pushed forward, deeper into the heart of the forest, the familiar path long gone, replaced by an endless maze of twisted trees and thick brambles. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around me, calling my name over and over. I didn't stop walking. My feet moved on their own, each step pulling me further into the darkness. Then, just as before, I found myself face to face with the vanishing trail. It was back. But this time, the path stretched out before me, impossibly wide and clear. I could feel it, it was waiting for me. Something made me stop and turn around. The mist had thickened into a wall behind me, an impenetrable barrier. The sounds of the forest had gone deathly quiet. I raised the camera, but this time, I wasn't filming to share a story, I was filming my last moments, just in case. As I walked the path, my mind began to break down, the sense of time slipping away. Everything felt wrong. My GPS was useless, flickering, showing no path, no way out. The trees had become alive, twisting, reaching, as though they were trying to grab me. The ground beneath me shifted, the earth trembling. I was no longer in the forest. It was like I had stepped into a place outside of time itself. And then, standing there before me, was Eli. His eyes were empty, but he spoke this time, his voice hollow and deep. You came back. That's how it works. I stared at him, unable to move, unable to speak. This was the forest's doing. It had taken him. And now it wanted me, too. You don't leave, Eli continued, his voice fading with every word. The trail, it chooses. The forest makes sure you never forget it. And when you try to leave, he trailed off, looking over his shoulder as if listening for something. It takes everything. Eli, what do you mean? I managed to whisper. What is this place? This is the heart of it, he said, pointing to the darkness ahead. It feeds on those who wander. It doesn't let go. Ever. I felt a chill sweep over me as the air grew heavier. A low rumble began beneath my feet, like the forest was waking up. It was coming for me. I turned to run, but the ground cracked open beneath my feet, and the trees surged forward, their roots pulling at my legs. I stumbled and fell to the ground, desperate to free myself. No. I screamed. The forest didn't answer. But something else did. A shadow moved in the mist. It was too large to be a person. Too monstrous to be real. My camera's lens flickered to life as I tried to keep filming, my hand trembling uncontrollably. I captured glimpses of something, watching me. Something ancient. Something that had lived in this forest long before humanity had ever stepped foot here. The entity was waiting. And I was its next meal. The fog closed in around me, and the shadow moved closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The next morning, the forest was calm again. The fog was gone. The trail had disappeared. I stood at the edge of the forest, my feet rooted to the earth, but the truth settled heavy on my chest. The forest had let me leave again. But now, I knew better. I was marked, and it would never truly release me. It had played with my mind, twisted my sense of reality, and showed me its dark heart. It had claimed Eli, and it would claim me too, when the time was right. I couldn't go back to my old life. The camera footage was destroyed, my records lost, but I knew what I had seen. And as I walked away from TTHIS National Forest for the last time, I knew that the forest was watching me, waiting for me to return. And I would return. One day. It always calls you back. Story: The Echoes Beneath the Ice. Mark Reynolds wasn't looking for adventure. He hadn't been since the accident. After losing his wife in a car crash 2 years ago, the idea of being alone in the world felt almost natural to him. The city's chaos was a reminder of his loss, the crowds pressing in on him, suffocating him in their demands. But nature was different. It was quiet. It understood the weight of grief. So, he drove north, deeper into the wilderness, far from any town, far from anyone who might remind him of the life he once had. His RV, which had become his mobile sanctuary, rumbled steadily along a snowy road, and he couldn't help but feel a fleeting sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, he felt detached from the constant barrage of memories and the chaos of his past life. The wilderness was his therapy, and the frozen lake he was heading toward would be his solace. A week of ice fishing. Just him, the cold, and the solitude. No distractions. No reminders of what he'd lost. Just the whistling wind and the steady hum of the RV's heater. Mark had been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. He would venture to the frozen lakes during winter, stay in the quiet, away from everyone. At first, it was to escape, to shut out the noise. Now, it was more about proving to himself that he could still handle the isolation, that he could still be strong enough to face his memories without breaking. The RV creaked to a stop by a small, frozen lake that Mark had found on the map. The lake was remote, miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid. just the way he liked it. Stepping out of the RV, he was met by the sharp bite of the cold. His breath fogged in the air, swirling like ghosts of his past, but he didn't mind. He was used to it. The lake stretched out before him, a vast, white expanse of ice, thick enough to drive on. The trees stood as silent sentinels around the perimeter, their branches heavy with ice and snow. The world muted beneath the blanket of winter. Perfect, he thought. Mark quickly set up camp, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering his ice fishing gear. The cold crept into his bones, but it was a familiar chill. The rhythmic grind of the auger cutting into the ice was comforting, its sharpness a reminder of the world outside his head. Then he heard it, a low, rumbling sound, deep beneath the ice. Mark paused, the auger still in his hands. He listened. The sound was distant, like a vibration coming from deep within the frozen depths. He'd heard the ice groan before. Anyone who spent time in the cold knew the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze. But this was different. This rumble was more profound, like something was moving beneath the surface. Mark brushed it off. Probably just the ice settling, he told himself, and continued drilling. By the time he finished, the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the snow. The cold crept in quickly. Mark set up his fishing line and settled in by the hole, his thick coat doing little to keep out the penetrating cold. But that rumbling sound stayed with him, echoing in his mind. Night fell, and the stars began to emerge in the clear, dark sky. Mark, wrapped in layers, sat by a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the biting chill. The stillness of the night was unsettling. The vast lake stretched out before him, white and silent. Then, something caught his eye. A faint, flickering light, coming from beneath the ice. At first, he thought it was a reflection. Maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But the light moved. Slowly, steadily, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. Mark rubbed his eyes, certain it was just his imagination. But no, the light was still there. It pulsed, faintly, then dimmed, only to pulse again, moving under the ice like a lantern swaying in the dark. His heart rate picked up. This was no reflection. The rational part of his mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was the light from a distant plane, or a reflection of some hidden object under the ice. But as he stared at the moving light, deep down, he knew the truth, it wasn't natural. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him closer to the edge of the lake. The ice was thick, but with every step, he felt exposed. The wind howled through the trees, and Mark shuddered, pulling his coat tighter around him. That's when he heard it again, the low rumble. It was louder this time, vibrating through the soles of his boots. His pulse quickened, and he stepped back from the lake. Something wasn't right. Something was moving beneath the ice. Mark hurried back to the warmth of the RV, his mind racing. What was happening? What was down there, beneath the ice? The next morning, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He went back out onto the lake, determined to figure out what he had seen the night before. The cold was harsher today, the wind biting through his clothes. He glanced at the hole he'd drilled the day before and froze. A long, jagged crack ran across the ice, stretching from the edge of the hole in a wild, unpredictable line. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It looked like something had pressed up from below, disturbing the ice. He knelt, running his gloved fingers along the crack. The ice felt thinner than it should be for the middle of winter. Something was wrong. As Mark leaned closer, his eyes caught a glint of metal beneath the ice. He widened his eyes. What was that? He leaned down, peering through the crack. At first, he thought it was just a chunk of old, rusted metal. But then he pulled it free, a jagged, sharp piece of metal. It was unlike anything he'd seen before. It was too smooth, too deliberate, as if it had been cut clean. There was no explanation for why it was here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining in the area for years. Suddenly, the rumbling came again, louder this time. Mark stood up, scanning the lake. The flickering light returned. It pulsed beneath the ice, moving closer. His heart skipped a beat. There was something down there. The stories he had heard as a child about strange happenings beneath frozen lakes, of things buried under the ice, of people disappearing, flooded his mind. He had always dismissed them as superstition, stories meant to frighten children. But now, standing here on the ice, he wasn't so sure. Mark backed away from the crack. The sound, the light, the metal, it was all pointing to something unnatural beneath the ice. That afternoon, as Mark was gathering firewood, he came across something strange, an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake. It looked abandoned, but there were fresh footprints leading up to the door. Curious, Mark approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, an old man sat hunched over a stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray. He looked up at Mark with tired eyes. "I didn't expect to see anyone out here," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. The old man grunted. "Not many come this far into the wilderness," he said, narrowing his eyes. Mark hesitated, then decided to ask. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice. And last night, I saw a light moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The old man's expression darkened, and he turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice. Things that shouldn't be disturbed." Mark's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" The old man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There was an old mining operation under that lake. Abandoned long ago. They were digging too deep, too far. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People disappear. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. That light you saw. It's not the only thing moving beneath the ice." Mark felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What's under there?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, Mark sat in the RV, watching the ice through the window. The light beneath the surface pulsed again, brighter than before. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the RV. Mark's hands trembled as he grabbed his gear and quickly packed his things. He couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. As he started the engine, the ground beneath the RV trembled. The rumbling was deafening. Now, Mark looked out toward the lake and his blood ran cold. The ice was cracking. Long fissures spread out from the center of the lake, and then, in the distance, a massive shape exploded upward through the ice, only to disappear again beneath the surface. Mark's heart pounded. Something dark, something enormous, was moving beneath the ice. Without thinking, he slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The RV lurched forward as the ice continued to crack behind him. He raced away from the lake, the sound of the ice shattering echoing in his ears. When Mark finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped. The ice was still. But the memory of what he had seen, of the light and the darkness beneath the ice, stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was beneath that lake wasn't finished yet. The weight of it lingered in his mind. Some things, he realized, should never be disturbed. Some things should stay buried. And the lake? It was still watching. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Even after driving miles down the desolate road, away from the lake, away from the cracking ice and the strange pulse that had threatened to tear everything apart, he still couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, expecting, hoping, to see only the endless stretch of snow-covered highway behind him. But the mirror reflected nothing but the dark emptiness of the road. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his body instinctively tensing as if some unseen force was just out of sight, keeping pace with him. The rumbling had stopped. The cracking ice, the flickering lights, all of it had ceased the moment he reached the main road. But that didn't mean it was gone. That didn't mean he was safe. Mark's mind raced as he drove. The old man's words echoed in his head, "The lake's alive. It's watching you." He dismissed them as mere superstition, old folklore meant to scare newcomers. But now, the truth of those words seemed too real to ignore. The metal shard he'd pulled from the ice, smooth, sharp, and unfamiliar, lingered in his mind. It was out of place, too clean, too deliberate, to be anything natural. And that flickering light, it wasn't a trick of the moonlight. Whatever had been beneath the ice, whatever had been woken from its slumber, it wasn't finished with him. The road ahead seemed endless, and the darkness crept into every corner of his mind. Mark had hoped that getting away from the lake would bring peace, but instead, his thoughts grew more erratic. He pulled over at a small diner, hoping to clear his mind, to find some semblance of normalcy. The place was empty, save for an elderly waitress behind the counter. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint clinking of dishes were the only sounds. As he sat down, the waitress gave him a wary look but said nothing. Mark glanced at the menu. He wasn't hungry. He hadn't been hungry since the night on the lake. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the unease that still gnawed at him. The waitress returned, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Long drive?" she asked, her voice soft. Mark nodded absently. "Too long," he muttered. He stared at the steaming cup of coffee, unable to focus on anything but the memories of the ice, the light, the rumble beneath the surface. "Where are you headed?" she asked again, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "Just out of here," Mark replied, not wanting to explain the truth. "Somewhere far away." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, with a sigh, she spoke again, softer this time. "You might want to be careful. Not everyone who drives through these parts leaves." Mark's head shot up, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. The waitress leaned in, lowering her voice. "The boundary waters. It's not just the lake. That's dangerous. It's the land, too. There are stories, old stories about people who disappear out there. Some say it's the lake that pulls them in, others say it's something in the woods. Either way, you don't come back." Her words sent a chill through him, colder than any winter wind. Mark stared at her, unable to find words. The unsettling sensation he'd been trying to push away, of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger. The waitress seemed to sense his unease and sat back, as if deciding whether or not to tell him more. The old folks around here talk about it, whatever it is that lives beneath the ice. Some say it's not just a creature, but something ancient, something that's been there since before the settlers. It doesn't like to be disturbed. Mark shook his head. I don't believe in that stuff. I saw something, okay? It didn't make sense. The waitress gave him a knowing look. It doesn't have to make sense. You just have to be careful. Mark barely slept that night. The diner had been quiet, too quiet, and the waitress's cryptic words had only fueled his anxiety. He couldn't stop thinking about the lake, the darkness beneath the ice, and the rumble. It had felt like the earth itself was alive, a heartbeat pulsing under the frozen surface. What had he stumbled upon? Why had the old man warned him? The next morning, Mark couldn't sit still. He had to leave. The sooner he got away from this place, the better. As he packed up his things and checked out of the small, dim motel, he noticed something odd. The receptionist was watching him closely, his gaze lingering a little too long. Mark felt his pulse quicken. It was as if the entire town knew. By the time he reached the highway, Mark's hands were sweating on the wheel. The air felt thick, like something was waiting just beyond the horizon. The landscape seemed to stretch on forever, but he couldn't escape the feeling that the lake, the wilderness, was still reaching for him. Mark drove for hours. There was no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to put miles between himself and the lake. The snowstorm that had started earlier that morning intensified, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He turned on the radio, hoping for a distraction, but all he heard was static. The road twisted and turned, the snow swirling in the air like ghosts. Then, without warning, the van sputtered, and the engine cut out. No, Mark muttered, slamming his hand on the wheel. He tried turning the key again. Nothing. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the trees like some ancient, forgotten beast. He had no choice but to pull over and try to figure out what had happened. As he got out of the van and popped the hood, the temperature dropped even further. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the ground in an endless sheet of white. Mark's breath turned to fog in front of him, and the wind sliced through his jacket. He fiddled with the engine, but he couldn't get it to start. The isolation of the moment was suffocating. He was alone in the wilderness again, and now it was as if everything that had been chasing him had caught up. Then, through the howling wind, Mark heard it. A faint rumble, barely audible at first, but growing louder, stronger. It sounded familiar. His heart sank. He recognized that sound. It was the same as the rumbling he had heard under the ice. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate slightly, as if something massive was moving just beneath the surface of the earth. Then, a flash of light, too bright to be natural, flared out of the snowstorm. It wasn't the weak glow of the moon, or even headlights from a distant car. This was something otherworldly, and it was moving, pulsing, just like the light beneath the ice. Mark's blood ran cold. He tried to move, to get back to the van, but his legs felt heavy. The snow was too deep, and the wind was too strong. He stumbled forward, his mind racing. The rumbling grew louder, closer. And then, a voice, a whisper in the wind. You can never leave. Mark froze. Mark never made it back to the van. They found his body days later, frozen in the snow, just a few miles from the spot where the RV had broken down. The investigators were baffled. There was no sign of a struggle. No footprints leading in or out of the area. Just a single, deep crack in the ice of a nearby lake. And the strange, glowing light beneath the ice. It had disappeared, just like Mark. But the locals knew. They always knew. The days passed, but the mystery surrounding Mark's disappearance didn't fade. The local authorities had tried to piece together the strange events that had transpired in the Boundary Waters, but no one really knew what had happened. The search for Mark's body had turned up little, just his frozen remains near the lake's edge and the eerie crack in the ice. There were whispers among the townspeople that something more sinister had been at play, something beyond the reach of conventional understanding. Life in the small town continued, though the absence of Mark hung over it like a heavy fog. The diner, where he had sat the day before his disappearance, remained open, but there was a subtle shift in the air. People came and went, but no one mentioned the lake anymore, not in polite conversation, at least. The waitress, who had warned Mark about the dangers of the Boundary Waters, went back to her quiet life, but she, too, carried the weight of the warning. She had given. It had been a month since Mark's death, and the lake, despite being so cold and desolate, had become a place of unsettling interest. The cracks in the ice that had formed that night after Mark left had never healed properly, and the lake had remained eerily still, as if waiting for something. It was a late winter evening when something strange occurred. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, and the sky was painted in hues of purple and orange, casting a glow over the snow-covered land. The townspeople who still lived in the area heard it first, the unmistakable, low rumbling beneath the ground. It wasn't the typical groan of settling ice, but a deep, resonating vibration that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The ice shifted, crackling ominously, as if some immense force was at work beneath the surface. Then, the light returned. At first, it was faint, just a soft flicker beneath the ice, barely noticeable unless you were standing directly at the shore. But it grew, pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat, faint at first, but unmistakable. The light was no longer a distant memory, it was real, it was alive, and it was not something that belonged in the natural world. As the light pulsed in the dark, the townspeople began to gather at the lake's edge, drawn by something they couldn't explain. They knew, deep down, that whatever had been disturbed on that lake was not done with them yet. The lake wasn't just alive, it was waiting for something, someone. One of the more curious townsfolk, an old man named Will, had spent his youth living in the Boundary Waters and had always heard the stories about the lake. He had heard the tales of strange creatures, of things that dwelled beneath the surface, of people who disappeared without a trace. He had never believed them, of course. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of the superstitious. But now, standing at the shore of the lake, watching the light pulse beneath the frozen surface, he could no longer ignore what was happening. The air around him felt charged, almost alive, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. Will had spent decades in this area, and yet never had he felt this level of unease, this sense of something wrong. Something's waking up, Will muttered to himself, his voice trembling. He looked around at the others who had gathered, a mix of fear and awe in their eyes. Something's coming back. The sound of the rumbling grew louder now, almost deafening, as if the very earth was groaning under the weight of something immense. The crack in the ice was widening, and with each tremor, more fissures began to form, stretching outward from the center of the lake. Will's breath caught in his throat as he watched the ice break apart, the massive shape shifting beneath the surface. It was huge, dark, and unrecognizable. It was not like anything from the natural world, a thing of nightmares, perhaps, or something far older, far darker. The ice heaved and cracked, and in that moment, Will understood. The stories were true. The people of the town fled in panic, scattering in all directions as the ice shattered. The rumbling grew to a deafening roar, and the light beneath the surface pulsed faster, more erratically. Something was coming, something immense, and it was not going to stop until it was free. Will turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest, but no matter how fast he moved, he could feel the pull of the lake behind him, an unrelenting force, something that knew him. Something that wanted him. It was as if the entire forest, the entire wilderness, was alive and aware of his every move. He stumbled toward his cabin, the wind biting at his face as the snow began to swirl around him. He barely made it inside before he heard it, the crashing of the ice as something enormous tore its way through the surface, emerging into the cold, biting air. The ground beneath Will's feet trembled as if the lake was breathing. The entire forest seemed to vibrate, its trees groaning as the ancient presence beneath the ice surged free. Through the frost-covered window, Will saw it. The massive shape, dark and undulating, shifting beneath the broken ice. It was no longer just a flicker of light. It was real. It was here. The lake had awoken. Will slammed the door shut, but he knew it was futile. The creature beneath the ice was not bound by the laws of nature. It had waited too long, and now it was free. As the days passed, the lake continued to churn, the ice shifting and breaking apart, as if trying to release whatever creature was still beneath. The town became a ghost town. No one stayed, no one who knew the truth, at least. They had all fled, abandoning their homes, their lives, in the face of what had been unleashed. Will stayed, though. He was one of the few who remained, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of curiosity. His cabin was the only one still standing, its windows shuttered, its door locked tight. Yet, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him. The light beneath. The ice had stopped pulsing, but the rumbling had not ceased. It was only a matter of time. And so, Will waited. Weeks passed, and the town was abandoned. The road leading to the boundary waters was quiet, the snow falling gently in the distance. No one would dare enter the wilderness again. For they knew that once the lake had awakened, there would be no escaping it. Some say the lake still watches, its frozen surface hiding an ancient power that no one can understand. The light may have gone, but the rumbling never stopped. Whatever had been woken beneath the ice was still there, lurking, waiting. And someday, someone else might come too close. But they would never leave. Not alive.
Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons, you guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.